Jon Jones. Jon Jones is the clearest example of fighter protection in the modern UFC. For more than a decade, Jones dominated the light heavyweight division, building a resume that many consider the greatest in MMA history. He beat champions, cleared out contenders, and survived multiple eras of competition. By the time he left the division, there was very little left for him to prove. When Jones finally moved up to heavyweight, expectations were massive. He returned after nearly 3 years away and fought Ciryl Gane for the vacant heavyweight title. On paper, Gane was one of the most dangerous strikers in the sport, an interim champion with speed and athleticism. But stylistically, it was a favorable matchup for Jones. The fight lasted barely 2 minutes. Jones took Gane down almost immediately and submitted him with ease. After that win, the heavyweight division should have moved forward, and the next fight should have been obvious. Tom Aspinall was younger, faster, and carrying real momentum. Instead, everything slowed down. Jones suffered an injury. Timelines became vague. The UFC avoided committing to anything concrete. Aspinall won the interim belt, defended it, and still waited. Jones wasn't stripped. He wasn't pressured. The division adjusted around him. That doesn't happen to most champions. Usually, if you don't defend, you get replaced. But Jon Jones exists in a different category. The UFC understands that a brutal loss at heavyweight doesn't just affect rankings, it affects history. So the risk is managed carefully. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor hasn't won a fight since 2020, and yet every conversation around him is still about massive main events, special treatment, and carefully selected opponents. And while that frustrates a lot of fans, there is a clear reason behind it. At his peak, Conor McGregor transformed the UFC financially. Events like UFC 202, 205, and UFC 229 didn't just sell well, they shattered company records. McGregor became the first fighter to hold 2 UFC titles simultaneously and brought mainstream attention to the sport on a scale the UFC had never seen. Because of that, McGregor stopped being treated like a normal fighter. Since 2020, Conor has lost twice to Dustin Poirier and suffered a serious leg injury that kept him out of competition for years. But the UFC has never talked about rebuilding him through the rankings. You never hear discussions about him fighting elite pressure wrestlers or top lightweight contenders. Instead, the focus is always on timing, recovery, and the right opponent for a comeback. McGregor is no longer just a competitor, he's an event. And the UFC treats events differently than fighters who are still climbing the ladder. Now for fighters that didn't receive the same level of support. Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou represents one of the clearest examples of a champion whose relationship with the UFC never fully settled, even at the top of the sport. His rise was fast and dramatic, but the stability that usually comes with becoming champion never really followed. Ngannou grew up in Cameroon in extreme poverty and worked in sand mines as a child. He didn't grow up training martial arts and didn't start fighting until later in life. Ngannou crossed multiple countries, spent time in immigration detention, and eventually arrived in Paris with no money or support, relying on shelters and sleeping rough before he was ever given a chance to train. Once he was finally given a chance to train, his progress was rapid. His size and power immediately separated him from other heavyweights. After entering the UFC, he began knocking opponents out quickly and decisively. His fights were short, violent, and easy to sell. Francis Ngannou didn't start training until around 26 or 27 years old. By 34, less than 8 years later, he was UFC heavyweight champion. From the outside, it looked like the perfect success story. But after winning the belt, things slowed down. Ngannou didn't fight often, contract talks dragged on, and disagreements between him and the UFC became public. UFC president Dana White openly spoke about tension between them, including a confrontation at UFC headquarters, and it became clear that the relationship had broken down. Ngannou was eventually stripped of the heavyweight title without losing it in the cage. The division moved forward, new champions were promoted, and Ngannou was no longer part of the UFC's plans. His skill level didn't disappear, but his place in the company did. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz grew up in Stockton, California, an area known for limited opportunity and constant pressure. Along with his brother Nick, he began training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a teenager under Cesar Gracie. That early start shaped his entire career. Diaz earned his black belt and built a style based on pressure, conditioning, and submissions rather than speed or power. From the beginning of his UFC career, Diaz was never treated as a company favorite. He came up through The Ultimate Fighter, fought constantly, and regularly accepted short-notice bouts against dangerous opponents. He wasn't protected early, and he wasn't guided carefully. He was relied on to take hard fights whenever they were needed. What separated Diaz was durability. He had one of the toughest chins in the sport, absorbed punishment most fighters couldn't, and kept pushing forward. Win or lose, he remained competitive, and that made him valuable. Everything changed when Diaz stepped in on short notice to fight Conor McGregor. McGregor was in his prime, riding momentum and massive hype. Diaz wasn't expected to win, but he survived the early pressure, stayed composed, and submitted McGregor in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. That win turned Diaz into a star overnight. But instead of being built around long-term, his relationship with the UFC became tense. Diaz spoke openly about pay, matchmaking, and feeling disrespected. He turned down fights, sat out for long periods, and criticized the company. From the UFC's side, he became difficult to manage. From Diaz's side, he felt undervalued. When Diaz did fight, it was usually in high-risk situations. Tough matchups, little flexibility, no clear long-term direction. Unlike other popular fighters, there was never an effort to protect his position or carefully guide his career. By the time Diaz was nearing the end of his contract, the situation was clear. The UFC wanted him gone, but only after using him one last time. He was matched against rising contenders rather than legacy opponents, with no attempt to rebuild or keep him active. In 2022, Nate Diaz left the UFC as a fan favorite, not a company priority. He didn't leave because he couldn't compete or because people stopped watching. He left because he chose not to re-sign his contract after realizing the UFC's setup wasn't working for him. Diaz publicly asked for release and wasn't getting the fights he wanted on the timeline he wanted, and he eventually fought out his deal and became a free agent when his contract expired after UFC 279. Once free, Diaz explored other opportunities, including boxing, because the UFC's restrictions limited what he could pursue before. And that's how the UFC treats fighters differently. Some are protected, others are valued until their contract is done. Once you're out, you're on your own. Like and subscribe for more content.